Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today we are going to look at the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is the third book of the Old Testament and the third book of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch refers to the first 5 books of the Bible, which have been traditionally believed to be written by Moses. This book goes over the rituals that priests must regulate and perform to maintain God's relationship with Israel. When looking at the structure of this book, the first half of the book contains regulations concerning sacrifices. There are 5 major offerings: the whole burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin or purification offering, the guilt offering, and the peace offering. I'm going to go over each offering and the purpose for them. First, let's look at the burnt offering. The animal used for this offering was a bull, sheep, goat, or a pigeon. The entire offering will be consumed on the altar with fire, and the purpose of the offering was to atone for the worshiper's sin. Second, is a grain offering. This offering will be fine flour, oil, frankincense, and unleavened bread. A grain offering could be given to God either uncooked or cooked in an oven. Now, the requirements for this grain offering were that it had to be finely ground and have oil and salt in it. It could not have any leaven or honey in it. When a person brought a grain offering to the priest, a small portion of it was offered to God with some frankincense on the altar, and the rest of the grain offering went to the priest, and there was no minimum requirement for how much grain to give. The grain offering was often presented after a burnt offering. It was not for atonement, since atonement requires blood, but was simply an act of worship to honor God. Third is a peace offering. The animals used for this offering was either a male or female goat, and was a voluntary sacrifice given to God for different purposes. It could be given as a way for the worshiper to show gratitude to God for his generosity, or it could be given as a way to fulfill a vow. This offering was usually combined with other offerings like the burnt offering. Unlike the burnt offering, however, only the animal fat was offered to God, while the rest of the animal can be eaten by the worshiper or other people. Fourth is a sin offering. The 3 primary functions of this offering were consecration, cleansing, and forgiveness. The sin offering was for sins committed in ignorance or unintentional sins. The type of animal offered depended on the status of the sinner. For example, a high priest who sinned unintentionally would offer a young bull, while a king or a prince will offer a young male goat. Common people offered a young female goat unless they were poor, in which case they were only required to offer 2 turtle doves or pigeons. The sinner was required to lay his hand on the head of the animal, and then the animal will be killed. Then the priest would take some of the blood and put it on the horns of the altar, and the rest of the blood was poured at the base of the altar. Fifth is a guilt offering. The animal for this offering is a ram, and the purpose of this offering was for reparations. For example, if a person forgot to fulfill a vow or accidentally ate food that was reserved for the priest, then the offender had to bring a ram to compensate the priest plus an extra 20%. This offering was also for social justice issues such as robbery, oppression, or extortion. The offender would have to compensate for the losses of the victim plus 20%. The common theme from these 5 sacrifices is the emphasis on God's holiness and the standard of holiness by which he holds for his people. This is where the second half of Leviticus focuses on. Leviticus chapters 8 through 10 comments on the requirements for priests and their need to demonstrate God's holiness. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 15 is known as the purity code for Israel. It contains regulations for ritual purity and impurity. Although many may think of religion as an individual thing, for Israel it was communal. This section explains how Israelites were to participate in the community and worship with holiness. Then we reach the high point of Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 16. This goes over the Day of Atonement. What is the Day of Atonement? Good question. The Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, was the most holy day for Israel. This event occurred once a year. The high priest was to perform elaborate rituals to atone for the sins of Israel, and before entering the tabernacle, the high priest was to bathe and put on special clothing. Then he would sacrifice a bull for a sin offering for himself and his family. The blood of the bull was to be sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant, and then the high priest will bring 2 goats, one to be sacrificed for the sins of Israel, and its blood was sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant as well, while the other goat was used as a scapegoat. The high priest would place his hands on its head, confessed over it the rebellion of the Israelites, and sent the goat out into the wilderness. Leviticus chapter 17 to 26 moves on to how Israel was to display holiness through their ethics. The sacrificial system, along with their code of ethics, continues to give an overall picture of God's holiness and his standard of holiness for his people. One way God's holiness was expressed is in Leviticus chapter 23 with Israel's feasts and festivals. These feasts and festivals were considered holy times that emphasized Israel's continued remembrance on God's redeeming work from the past. Typically, every festival included rejoicing and rest from normal work. This was to recall God's act of rejoicing and resting after creating the heavens and the earth. Leviticus chapter 25 goes into detail on God's rules regarding the Sabbath rest of the land, which happened every 7th year when Israel was not allowed to work their land during the year. Then the chapter explains the year of Jubilee, which occurred every 50 years. Now, during the years when the Jubilee occurs, the land would experience 2 Sabbaths, and people who had to sell themselves into indentured servitude and their land will be reunited once again. These same people no longer had to work as slaves to work off their debt, even if they had debt remaining. There was an emphasis on fair treatment of poor Israelites who had to sell themselves into slavery. During the year of Jubilee, they could not be treated as slaves anymore, and their owners was not allowed to rule over them anymore, and their children weren't allowed to be inherited as slaves to the owners. The purpose for both the Sabbath of the land and the year of Jubilee is to reflect God's holiness and compassion towards his people. It was to also make sure that his people could not unjustly enslave others and continue to use their debt against them forever. So when looking at the book of Leviticus, we get a picture of God himself. God is holy, yet he desires to join his people who must also be holy. And for people to have a relationship with a holy God, they must fulfill God's standard and must not ignore or change them. Thank you to today's sponsor, On Reverence. They offer a free digital worship music app called Maskell. If you want to find out some more, I'll leave some links below in the description box. If you missed the last video about the book of Exodus, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. Until next time, see you.